Hey everyone, close your eyes for just a moment. Not to sleep yet, we're not quite there, but to imagine something simple. Picture the world before the sun rises. It's not completely dark, but it's also not entirely light. This is the in-between time, when the sky is still unsure of its own colour. That's where our story begins tonight, in that soft, uncertain moment that happens every single day, though most of us sleep right through it. So dim your lights, get comfortable, and prepare to drift to the sound of Greek mythology with a campfire. You know that feeling when you wake up too early? Maybe your internal clock got confused, or the neighbour's dog started barking, or you just happened to open your eyes at some odd hour like 4:47 in the morning. And you look out the window expecting darkness. But instead there's this strange glow. Not from streetlights or passing cars. Something else. The sky looks like someone spilled diluted ink across it. Blue-black, maybe, or deep purple turning grey at the edges. The ancient Greeks had a specific moment in mind when they thought about dawn, and it wasn't the dramatic sunrise we photograph for social media. It was this earlier moment. The dawn before dawn, they called it. They noticed, because they had time to notice things we usually don't, that morning doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in. And in that seeping, in those minutes before the sun actually makes its appearance, something magical happens to the world. The temperature drops to its lowest point. The air becomes impossibly still. And moisture that's been floating around as invisible vapour suddenly decides to become visible, settling on every surface as tiny beads of water we call dew. Now, the Greeks were excellent observers. They watched the world the way you might watch a really good slow-motion video, catching details that rush by when you're not paying attention. And they asked themselves, why does water appear on the grass and leaves right at dawn? Why not at midnight, or noon, or during dinner? They didn't have our modern meteorology or our understanding of dew points and relative humidity. What they had were stories. And honestly, their stories explain the feeling of dew better than any scientific description ever could. Let me introduce you to Eos. Her name is pronounced E-O-S-S, soft and gentle, like a sigh. She was the goddess of dawn, and her job, if you can call it a job, was to wake up before everyone else in the entire world and open the gates of heaven so her brother Helios, the sun, could drive his chariot across the sky. Every single morning. No days off. No sleeping in on weekends. Think about that for a second. Imagine being the person who has to wake up first, not just in your house, not just in your city, but in the entire cosmos. You'd need a very reliable alarm clock. Or maybe you just stop sleeping altogether. The Greeks imagined Eos rising from her bed, and yes, even goddesses had beds, apparently, in the far eastern edge of the world. They pictured her home as a palace where the ocean, which they thought of as a river that circled the entire earth, met the sky. A house built right on the edge of everything. Prime real estate, if you don't mind the commute. Here's what I love about how they described her. Eos had rosy fingers. Not rosy hands, not rosy arms, fingers. Specifically, because they'd watched dawn closely enough to notice that the first light doesn't flood the sky all at once. It reaches. Little tendrils of pink and gold appear at the horizon, stretching up into the darkness like someone's fingers spreading across a table. Those were Eos's fingers, pushing open the gates of heaven, reaching up to pull back the curtain of night. She had a saffron-coloured robe. You might not think much about saffron unless you've cooked with it. It's that expensive spice that comes from crocus flowers, the one that costs more per ounce than gold. Its colour is intense. Deep yellow-orange, warm and luminous. Exactly the colour of the sky when dawn is just getting started. When the darkness begins to blush. The Greeks chose that word carefully. They wanted you to see that specific colour in your mind, that particular warmth spreading across the eastern horizon. And she had wings. Golden wings that caught the early light, which makes sense if you think about it. Dawn moves. It doesn't just appear in one spot and stay there. It travels across the landscape, touching the mountain peaks first, then flowing down into the valleys, racing across the ocean and climbing up the walls of cities. To the Greeks, watching this progression, it looked like something flying. Something beautiful and swift, bringing light to the dark places. Every morning, Eos would rise and yoke her horses, Lampos and Phaethon, bright and shining, to her chariot. These weren't your regular horses. They were made of early morning itself, all silver white like mist, with manes that glowed. She'd drive them across the sky ahead of her brother's sun chariot, announcing his arrival. "Here comes the light," she'd say with her rosy fingers. "Get ready. Day is coming." But here's the thing about Eos. She wasn't just a mechanical goddess, pulling some cosmic lever to turn on the daylight. She was described as having a tender heart, soft, easily moved to feeling. And that tenderness led her into a love story that would change the morning forever. Eos fell in love with a mortal man named Tithonus. Now, if you're a goddess who lives forever, falling for someone who definitely won't is probably not the best decision. But love doesn't really care about your immortality status, does it? Tithonus was beautiful. Not just regular handsome, but the kind of beautiful that makes immortal beings stop their chariots and stare. He was a prince of Troy, which was a real place, by the way. Archaeologists found it on the coast of modern Turkey, right where the ancient stories said it would be. The Greeks loved setting their myths in real locations. It made everything feel more possible. Eos saw Tithonus one morning as she was making her daily journey across the sky, and that was it. She was smitten. Completely gone. And when you're the goddess of dawn, you're used to getting what you want, so she simply swept down and carried him away to her palace at the edge of the world. They were happy. Very happy. But Eos kept thinking about the future. She'd watched mortals her whole eternal life. Watched them grow old, grow weak, and eventually die. She couldn't bear the thought of losing Tithonus. So she went to Zeus, king of the gods, and asked him for a favour. "Make Tithonus immortal," she said. "Let him live forever, like me." Zeus agreed. And here's where the story takes a turn that's almost funny if it weren't so sad. Eos forgot to ask for eternal youth along with eternal life. She asked for the wrong thing, and gods are sticklers about the exact wording of requests. It's like making a wish with a tricky genie. So Tithonus lived, and lived, and lived, but he kept aging. His hair went grey, then white, his skin wrinkled, his back bent. His voice, which had once been strong and clear, became thin and cricket-like. He kept getting older and older, but he couldn't die. Eventually, he became so small and withered that Eos, heartbroken, had to keep him in a room in her palace, where he chirped endlessly in a voice she could barely hear. Some versions of the story say she eventually turned him into a cicada. You know, those insects that make that endless droning sound in late summer. Which is either merciful or terribly sad, depending on how you look at it. But the detail I want you to focus on is this. Every morning, when Eos rose to begin her journey across the sky, she wept. Not loud, dramatic sobbing. This was a quiet, constant grief. The tears of someone who has to keep going, keep doing her job, and keep bringing the dawn, even though her heart is broken. Even though the person she loves is suffering and there's nothing she can do to fix it. And where did her tears fall? On the earth. On the grass and flowers and leaves. Every single morning, Eos cried as she opened the gates of heaven, and her tears became dew. This is how the ancient Greeks explained those beads of moisture that appear at dawn. They weren't just water condensing from cool night air. They were sorrowful. They were in love. They were the grief of an immortal being who had to watch time destroy everything she cared about, and yet still had to show up for work every day and make the morning beautiful. When you think about it that way, dew stops being just a weather phenomenon. It becomes something else. A reminder that even in the middle of sadness, beauty still happens, that light still comes, that the world still turns and the morning still arrives, no matter what we're feeling inside. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's a lovely story, but they didn't really believe dew was made of goddess tears, did they? They must have known something about how it actually forms. Well, yes and no. The ancient Greeks were incredibly smart. They were the first people in the Western world to really practice what we'd call science, observation, hypothesis, and logical reasoning. Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century BCE, wrote extensively about weather and tried to explain natural phenomena without resorting to gods and myths. He understood that dew had something to do with vapour in the air. He noticed that dew formed more heavily in valleys than on hilltops, more in areas with vegetation than on bare rock, and more on clear nights than cloudy ones. He was genuinely trying to figure out the mechanics of it. But here's what's interesting. Even the scientists and philosophers still used the myths. Not because they were ignorant, but because the myths did something that pure mechanical explanation couldn't. They connected the phenomenon to human experience. They made it meaningful. When a Greek farmer walked through his olive grove early in the morning and saw the dew shining on the leaves, yes, he probably understood on some level that it had to do with temperature and moisture in the air. But he also thought of Eos. He thought of her story. And in thinking of her story, he connected his own experience of grief and persistence to something cosmic. His losses, his sorrows, his need to keep working even when his heart hurt, all of that was reflected in the morning dew. He wasn't alone in his sadness. Even the goddess of dawn wept every morning. This is what I call poetic science. It's not anti-science or ignorance. It's a way of understanding the world that includes emotional truth alongside physical truth. The dew forms because warm, moist air from the day cools down during the night until it reaches its dew point, and the water vapour condenses into liquid. That's the physics. But the dew also appears because even immortal beings grieve, and grief has to go somewhere. And sometimes it falls gently on the world as something beautiful. That's the poetry. We've lost something in our modern approach to nature. We know so much more about the mechanisms of things, but we've stopped asking what they mean, what they feel like, how they connect to our inner lives. The Greeks would find that strange. They'd wonder why we'd want only half the story. Artists have been trying to capture dawn for thousands of years, and if you look at enough paintings of sunrise, you start to notice something. The colours are almost always the same across cultures and centuries. That warm progression from deep blue to purple to rose to gold to that bright, almost white-yellow of full daylight. The ancient Greeks weren't big on painting landscapes. They preferred pottery and sculpture. But they described dawn's colours obsessively in their poetry. Rosy-fingered dawn shows up in Homer's epics so often it becomes like a refrain. A reminder that another day is starting in the story. Gold and saffron and crimson were the words they used over and over. They were trying to pin down something that changes as you watch it, trying to describe a process that takes 30 minutes, but feels both longer and shorter than that at the same time. Later, artists became obsessed with dawn light. The Hudson River School painters in 19th century America practically built their entire reputation on getting sunrise and sunset right. Thomas Cole, Frederick Church, these guys would hike for hours to find the perfect spot to watch dawn break over a valley or a river. They'd make sketch after sketch, trying to catch the exact shade of pink that happens at 6:12 a.m., but is gone by 6:13. Then you have J. M. W. Turner, the British painter who was so obsessed with light that he supposedly had himself tied to the mast of a ship during a storm so he could experience and remember the exact visual chaos of it. His sunrise paintings are almost abstract, swirls of orange and yellow and white, sometimes barely any recognizable objects, just the feeling of light emerging from darkness. Why the obsession? I think it's because dawn is the only time of day when we can actually watch light being born. During the day, light is just there, constant, steady, reliable. At night, it's gone. But at dawn, we see the transition. We see darkness becoming light in real time. And there's something deeply moving about witnessing any kind of birth, even the birth of a regular old Tuesday morning. The Japanese have a whole aesthetic tradition around dawn called akatsuki, the deep red time before sunrise. They wrote poems about it, painted it, and designed gardens to be viewed specifically in that pre-dawn light. They understood that morning has phases, and the phase before the sun actually appears is the most emotionally complex. It's full of potential and uncertainty. The day might be wonderful or terrible, but right now, in this early light, it's still just possibility. When Western artists discovered Japanese prints in the 19th century, they were struck by how differently the Japanese captured dawn light. Less interested in photographic realism, more interested in mood. Thin strips of graduated colour, silhouettes, suggestion rather than description. It influenced everyone from the Impressionists to Art Nouveau designers. Claude Monet painted the same haystack at different times of day to show how light changed its appearance. His dawn haystacks look almost unreal, pink and lavender shadows, golden highlights, the whole thing shimmering like it might dissolve. He was trying to paint the way dawn feels, not just how it looks, that dreamy, not quite awake quality. The softness of everything before the day hardens into its full, bright reality. The Greeks weren't the only ones who noticed dew and decided it needed an explanation involving divine beings and cosmic drama. Every culture that bothered to pay attention to dawn came up with stories. In ancient Egypt, dew was associated with the goddess Tefnut, who represented moisture in all its forms. She had a temper, apparently. Her myths involve her storming off into the Nubian desert when she got angry with her father, the sun god Ra. The other gods had to coax her back, and when she finally returned, she cried tears of joy that fell as dew and rain. So there's your theme again. Divine tears becoming morning moisture. Different goddess, same basic emotional weather system. The Celts had a more cheerful take. They thought dew was left behind by fairies, dancing in the meadows at night. All that frolicking worked up a sweat, presumably, and by morning the fairy moisture had condensed on the grass, which is a hilarious explanation if you think about it. Fairy sweat. But it makes sense in their worldview. Fairies were active at night, humans during the day. Dew appeared at the transition point between those two times, so obviously it was evidence of fairy activity. Mystery solved. In some Native American traditions, dew was considered sacred, particularly the dew that collected on certain herbs and plants. Medicine people would gather it carefully at dawn, believing it carried special healing properties. They weren't wrong, actually. Dew is incredibly pure water. It's freshly condensed from vapor, so it hasn't picked up minerals or impurities from the ground. And gathering it at dawn, when it's cleanest, before dust and pollen start floating around. That's just good practical sense dressed up in spiritual practice. Hindu tradition has a whole concept around dew called tuhen. It's associated with coolness, purity, and the idea of the divine becoming manifest in the physical world. Morning dew in Hindu poetry often represents that moment, when the formless takes form, when spirit becomes matter. There's a beautiful parallel there to what dew actually is: invisible water, vapor becoming visible droplets. The hidden becoming seen. Chinese poets wrote endlessly about dew, especially autumn dew, which they associated with impermanence and the passing of time. There's a famous line that goes something like, "Dew forms at night and vanishes by morning, like human life," which is dark, sure, but also kind of peaceful when you think about it. Everything is temporary. Everything arrives and then leaves. Even the sadness of that thought is temporary. What strikes me about all these different cultural explanations is that they all agree on the emotional tone of dew. It's always associated with something tender, pure, temporary, and slightly melancholy. Nobody invented myths about dew being the sweat of warriors or the spit of dragons. It's always tears, or fairy dancing, or divine manifestation. Soft things, gentle things. Even when different cultures had no contact with each other, they felt the same way about those drops of water shining on morning grass. Maybe that tells us something. Maybe certain natural phenomena just have an inherent emotional quality that humans recognize regardless of their culture or time period. Maybe dew really does feel like sadness that's become beautiful. Like something crying that's also sparkling in the light. Okay? So now let me tell you how dew actually forms, according to modern science. And I promise this won't be boring, because the actual physics of it is kind of magical in its own way. Air can hold water. You know this. Humidity is literally just water, vapor floating around in the air. But here's the catch. Warm air can hold more water than cold air, significantly more. The warmer the air, the more moisture it can carry around invisibly. During the day, the sun heats everything up. The ground, the plants, the air. As things heat up, water evaporates from soil, leaves, ponds, puddles, and even morning dew that's left over from yesterday. All that water goes into the air as vapor. The air is like a sponge, soaking it up. Then night comes. The sun goes down. And here's where it gets interesting. The ground, which spent all day absorbing heat, starts radiating that heat back out into space. This happens faster on clear nights because clouds act like a blanket, trapping heat. But on a cloudless night, the heat just pours upward into the atmosphere and the surface of the Earth cools down quickly. As the ground cools, it cools the air right above it. And as that air cools, something happens. It can't hold as much water anymore. The water vapor that was perfectly happy floating around, invisibly, suddenly has nowhere to be. So, it condenses. It turns back into liquid water, forming tiny droplets on every surface. Grass, leaves, car windshields, and spider webs. The temperature at which this happens is called the dew point. It's different depending on how humid the air is. On a very humid day, the dew point might be only a few degrees below the air temperature. So dew forms easily, as soon as things cool down even a little. On a dry day, the dew point might be way down there, so you need significant cooling before you get dew. Here's a detail I love. Dew forms most heavily on surfaces that are good at radiating heat. Grass is excellent at this. Flat leaves are great. Metal car roofs are amazing. That's why your windshield is always covered in dew, even when the sidewalk next to your car is barely damp. These surfaces cool down faster than the air around them, so they reach the dew point first. Dew doesn't fall from the sky. This is a common misconception. It forms right there on the surface, condensing directly onto whatever it's touching. It's not rain in miniature. It's a completely different process. Rain forms up in clouds and falls down. Dew forms right here on the ground, pulling water directly from the air around it. The amount of dew that forms can be substantial. In some desert regions, plants rely on dew as a significant water source. There are beetles in the Namib Desert that have evolved specialized textured backs that are incredibly good at collecting dew from morning fog. They literally drink the dew they collect on their own bodies. Evolution is wild. Scientists have measured dew formation rates, and on a good night you can get 1/10 of a millimetre of water per hour. That might not sound like much, but multiply it across an entire field over the course of a 6-hour night, and you're talking about real water, enough to matter to plants, enough to show up as significant moisture. And here's where the science circles back to poetry. Dew is heaviest at dawn. Not at midnight, not at 3 a.m, but specifically right around sunrise, because that's when the temperature difference is greatest, when the earth is coldest and the air hasn't started warming up yet. The Greeks were right to associate dew with that specific time. Dew and dawn are genuinely linked, not by a weeping goddess, but by the simple physics of heat and cold, vapour and liquid, and the dance between air and earth that happens every single morning, whether we're awake to see it or not. There's something philosophically significant about dawn that goes beyond mythology or meteorology. It's about beginnings, about renewal, about the fact that every single day the world offers you a reset button. The ancient Stoics, that school of Greek and Roman philosophy that focused on maintaining inner peace regardless of external circumstances, were big on morning practices. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who wrote his philosophical thoughts in a journal that became the book Meditations, often wrote about morning. He'd remind himself, first thing, when you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. Not exactly a cheerful affirmation. But then he'd follow it up. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognised that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own. He was preparing himself, using the morning as a time to set his mind right before the chaos of the day. Dawn was a moment of clarity, of perspective, before everything got complicated. The Buddhists have a concept called beginner's mind, approaching everything as if for the first time without preconceptions. Dawn is like that. Every morning is the first morning, in a sense. Yes, you've seen thousands of dawns, but you've never seen this specific one. The light is slightly different, the temperature has its own particular quality. The dew has formed in its own unique pattern. If you pay attention, every dawn is genuinely new. This is not just poetic wishful thinking. There's actual psychology behind it. Sleep resets your brain chemistry. The cortisol that keeps you alert drops during sleep and then rises sharply right before you wake up. Melatonin, which makes you drowsy, drops away. Your brain waves shift from the slow patterns of deep sleep to faster, more active patterns. When you wake up, you're genuinely in a different neurochemical state than you were when you went to bed. Dawn, then, is a biological reset as much as a temporal one. Your brain is quite literally starting fresh. Whatever was weighing on you yesterday has been processed during sleep and filed away differently in your memory. The emotions attached to it have been moderated. You're not the same person who went to bed. You're a slightly revised version. This is why the common wisdom says, sleep on it, when you're facing a difficult decision. Not because magical decision-making fairies visit you in the night, although, who knows, maybe the Celts were onto something, but because your brain genuinely reorganises information during sleep, and things often look different, clearer, more manageable, in the morning light. Dawn represents possibility. It's the only time of day when the future is completely unwritten. At noon, half the day is gone. By evening, you're dealing with the consequences of everything you've already done. But at dawn? At dawn, it's all potential. Nothing has gone wrong yet. Nothing has gone right either, but that's okay. You get to decide what kind of day it's going to be. This is probably why so many spiritual and religious traditions emphasize morning practices. Prayer at dawn, meditation at sunrise, yoga in the early light. It's not arbitrary. Morning is when we're most capable of setting an intention, making a commitment, and deciding how we want to show up in the world. By evening, we're tired. We're reactive. But in the morning, we still have agency. Even the word dawn itself is interesting. It comes from an Old English word meaning to become day. Not the start of day, but the active process of becoming. Dawn isn't a point in time, it's a transition, a verb pretending to be a noun. And if dawn is a becoming, then maybe we're all becoming something every morning too. Not quite the same as we were yesterday. Not yet what we'll be by tonight. Just in the process of turning into the next version of ourselves. Like the sky turning from dark to light. Like water vapour becoming visible droplets on the grass. Even though most people today have never heard of Eos, she's still everywhere in our language and culture. We've just forgotten where the references come from. The word east probably derives from the same root as Eos, the direction of dawn, the place where light comes from. Ancient peoples oriented themselves by the sun, and east was always the direction of morning, of beginning, of origin. Maps used to be drawn with east at the top before north became the standard. Orient, which means to find your direction, comes from oriens, the Latin word for east, for rising. When we talk about being in the twilight of something, a career, an era, a person's life, we're using dawn's opposite, dusk, to mean ending. But twilight exists on both sides of the day. Morning twilight is the time before dawn, when Eos is just waking up. We use it less often in that context, though. We're more comfortable with endings than beginnings, apparently. Aurora is the Roman version of Eos, and we use that word for the spectacular light shows of the polar regions. Aurora borealis, northern lights. Aurora australis, southern lights. Those shimmering curtains of green and red and purple in the sky are named after the goddess of dawn because they look like what the Greeks imagined when they pictured Eos's robes and wings spreading across the sky. Renaissance artists loved depicting Aurora/Eos. There's a famous fresco by Guido Reni on the ceiling of a Roman palace showing Aurora in her chariot, scattering flowers as she races across the sky ahead of Apollo, the Roman sun god. She's all flowing robes and dramatic gestures, very Baroque, very look how well I can paint billowing fabric. But even in that over-the-top style, there's something genuinely beautiful about it. The painter captured that sense of movement and light that the original Greek poets were trying to describe. Romantic poets brought Eos back in a big way. Keats, Shelley, and Byron, they all wrote about dawn using classical imagery. They'd studied Greek and Latin in school. It's what educated people did back then. So they knew all the myths, and they loved the idea of connecting their contemporary feelings to these ancient stories. When Keats writes about dawn, he's thinking about Eos. When he describes morning dew, he's thinking about her tears. Even in modern times, when most people have zero classical education, the imagery persists. How many Instagram posts have you seen with sunrise photos captioned with something about new beginnings, fresh starts, or hope? That's Eos. We're still using her framework for understanding what dawn means, even though we've forgotten her name. Musicians have written countless pieces called Dawn, or Daybreak, or Morning. Grieg's Morning Mood from Peer Gynt is probably the most famous. That gentle rising melody that sounds exactly like light spreading across a landscape. Ravel wrote a piece called Daphnis et Chloe, with a sunrise section that's so evocative you can almost feel the temperature change and see the colours shifting. In literature, dawn scenes are almost always significant. Characters make big decisions at dawn. Armies march at dawn. Lovers say goodbye at dawn. Nothing important happens at 2:37 p.m. in literature but dawn. Dawn is when everything shifts. There's a reason for this beyond tradition. Dawn feels meaningful. It activates something in us, some ancient recognition that this moment, this transition from dark to light, matters. We're wired to notice it. Our ancestors' survival depended on being aware of the day-night cycle, on waking with the light. That's not superstition or cultural conditioning. That's biology. So when we talk about dawn, when we photograph it, paint it, or write about it, we're participating in something humans have been doing for thousands of years. We're acknowledging that this time of day is special, sacred, even though we might not use that word. And somewhere in that acknowledgement is the ghost of Eos, still doing her job, still opening the gates of heaven, still weeping her tears that fall as dew. Let me bring this home now, bringing it back to you, lying here in the dark or near dark, listening to this story, thinking about morning. Tomorrow, dawn will come. It always does. That's the thing about dawn. It's the most reliable phenomenon in existence. Wars start, empires fall, and species go extinct. But dawn keeps showing up. Every single morning, the earth turns, the sun rises, and light returns. You might not see it. You might sleep through it, curtains drawn, alarm not set for another 2 hours. But it'll happen anyway. Somewhere, the sky is already starting to lighten. The eastern horizon is beginning its transformation from black to blue-grey. The stars are fading. And on the grass outside your window, on the leaves of trees, and on the spiderweb stretched between bushes, water vapour is condensing into dew. If the ancient Greeks were right, and I'm not saying they were, but I'm not saying they were wrong either, then somewhere in those dewdrops is sorrow. The accumulated sadness of all the goodbyes we've said, all the things we've lost, and all the beautiful moments we couldn't make last. Eos is crying for Tithonus, sure, but also all of us are crying for our own versions of eternal love, meeting mortal time. But here's the thing about dew. It sparkles. When the sun finally rises, when that light hits those tiny droplets, they light up like diamonds. Like tiny prisms, breaking sunlight into rainbows. All that sorrow, all those tears, and they become something that makes the morning more beautiful, not less. That's the real wisdom in the myth. Not that dew is literally made of goddess tears. Obviously it's condensation. We covered that. But there's a truth in the metaphor. Our sadness, our grief, our losses, they don't just disappear, they don't evaporate. They become part of the fabric of our lives, part of what makes a morning, part of what makes light meaningful. You can't have dawn without the night that came before it. You can't have dew without darkness and cooling and that particular temperature drop that happens in the hours before sunrise. The beautiful things require the difficult things. They're not separate, they're the same process, just different phases. When you wake up tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever you next wake early enough to see dawn, maybe take a moment. Look at the light if you can. Notice how it changes, how it moves, and a morning, and how it slowly transforms the world from shadow into colour. And if there's dew, on the grass, on the car window, on the tomato plants in your garden, look at that too. Really look at it. See how it catches the light, how it makes ordinary things shimmer, how it's temporary. By mid-morning, it'll be gone, evaporated, returned to vapour. But while it's there, it's perfect, completely, unreasonably perfect. That's what Eos gives us every morning. Not just light, not just the end of darkness, but this reminder. Begin again. Whatever happened yesterday, however tired you are, however much you're grieving or struggling or just worn down by the ordinary difficulty of being alive, begin again. The day is new. The light is returning. And look, even the grass is sparkling. You know what's funny? We spend so much time and energy trying to hold on to things, trying to make moments last, to freeze time, to keep things from changing. But everything we just talked about, dawn, dew, morning light, it's all about impermanence. It's all about things that appear and then disappear, and somehow that's what makes it precious. The dew will evaporate, the dawn will become a full day. Eos will complete her journey, and tomorrow she'll have to do it all over again, and that's okay. That's actually the whole point. The gift isn't that these things last forever. The gift is that they return. Every morning, regular as clockwork, reliable as sunrise. You get another chance tomorrow, another dawn, another beginning. The world keeps offering you that, no matter how many times you've messed up, given up, or just gotten so tired you couldn't imagine starting over. But you do start over. We all do. Because morning comes whether we're ready for it or not. And when it comes, it brings light and dew and the faint pink fingers of a goddess who has been doing this job since before anyone can remember, and who will keep doing it long after we're gone. There's something profoundly comforting in that. In knowing that the big things, sunrise, morning, light, don't depend on us. They happen regardless. We can participate in them, notice them, and appreciate them. But we don't have to earn them. We don't have to be worthy of them. Dawn comes for everyone. The light returns for all of us. Even Eos in her grief, especially Eos in her grief, keeps showing up for work, keeps making the morning beautiful. So let that be your thought as you drift off tonight. Tomorrow morning, somewhere in the world, the sky will start to lighten. The darkness will gradually, gently give way to colour. The temperature will drop to its lowest point, and moisture will condense on every cool surface, making the world sparkle. And whether you wake to see it or sleep peacefully through it, dawn will come. The light always returns. The world always begins again, and on the grass outside your window, tiny drops of water will catch the early sun and glow like fallen stars, like tears that have been transformed into jewels, like the most ordinary magic that happens every single morning, expected, and yet somehow always surprising, always new. That's the gentle tale of Eos and the morning sky. That's how dew was said to form, not just condensation, though it's that too. But something else, something about love and loss and the way beauty emerges from sorrow. Something about how even the gods have to keep going, have to keep showing up, and have to do their work even when their hearts are broken. And maybe that's the most comforting part of all. That keeping going is built into the structure of the universe. That continuation isn't something you have to force or manufacture. It's just what happens. The earth keeps turning, the sun keeps rising, the goddess keeps driving her chariot across the sky, tears and all. You don't have to be strong to begin again. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to be there when the morning comes, and the morning will do the rest. It'll bring the light. It'll warm the air. It'll evaporate the dew and reset everything for another cycle. Your job is just to notice, if you can. To appreciate, if you're able. To recognize that this daily miracle, this transformation from darkness to light, is happening for you, with you, and around you. The ancient Greeks understood something we're still trying to relearn, that stories and science aren't enemies. That you can know exactly how dew forms, understand the physics of condensation and dew points and radiant cooling, and still find meaning in the myth of a weeping goddess. Both things can be true. The water condenses because of temperature change, and the morning sparkles because of ancient sorrow transformed into beauty. These aren't contradictions. They're different languages describing the same truth. That truth is this: renewal is possible. Every single day, renewal is not just possible, but inevitable. You can't stop it if you try. The morning will come. The light will return. the world will offer you another chance to begin, to try again, to see things differently than you did yesterday. And here's what I love most about the dew. It doesn't last. By the time you've had your coffee, checked your messages, gotten dressed, and stepped outside, it's gone. Evaporated back into air. The sparkle disappears, the grass is just grass again. But you saw it for that brief window. You witnessed the transformation, and tomorrow morning it'll happen again. That's the rhythm of it. Not permanence, but recurrence. Not, this will last forever, but this will come back. And somehow that's better. Because if the beautiful moments lasted forever, they'd stop being beautiful. They'd become normal, expected, invisible. It's the temporary nature of dawn light, of dew on grass, of that particular quality of early morning air. That's what makes us pay attention. That's what makes us care. Eos knew this. In the story, she wanted permanence, wanted Tithonus to live forever with her, and look how that turned out. The thing she tried to preserve withered and diminished, until it was barely recognizable. What she should have asked for, what maybe the myth is trying to tell us she learned to accept, was not permanence, but return. Not, let this moment last forever, but let me experience this kind of moment again and again, even knowing it will always end, even knowing it will always hurt a little when it does. That's a more mature kind of hope, isn't it? Not the hope that things will never change, never end, never hurt. But the hope is that after the ending comes another beginning. That after the darkness comes another dawn. That the cycle continues, and in that continuation is a kind of promise. The dew will form again tomorrow. The light will return. Eos will wake, yoke her horses, and drive across the sky with her rosy fingers, spreading light ahead of her brother's sun. She'll cry her quiet tears, because the grief doesn't go away, the story doesn't tell us it goes away. But she'll do her job anyway. She'll make the morning beautiful anyway. Because that's what morning is. Beautiful and sad at the same time, sparkling with tears, glowing with light, always ending and always beginning again. If you listen very carefully, in that moment, right before you fall asleep, you can almost hear it. Not actual sound, but that sense of the world turning, the night deepening, and the temperature slowly dropping. Somewhere, dew is starting to form. Moisture is condensing from the cooling air, settling on leaves and grass blades and spider silk. The earth is preparing for morning, getting ready for another transformation, another turn of light. And you're part of that. Your breathing slowing, your body temperature dropping slightly as you sink into sleep. Your mind beginning its nightly work of processing and reorganizing and preparing for tomorrow. You're not separate from the dawn cycle, you're in it. Your own small version of death and rebirth happening every 24 hours, every sleep and wake. The ancient peoples understood this too. They didn't see themselves as apart from nature, observing it from the outside. They were inside it, subject to the same rhythms, the same cycles. When they told stories about dawn goddesses and tears becoming dew, they were telling stories about themselves. About human sorrow and human resilience, and the way we have to keep going even when we're grieving, even when we're tired, even when we're not sure we have another dawn in us. But we do. We always do. Because dawn doesn't ask permission. It doesn't check if you're ready. It just comes, gentle and inexorable, bringing light whether you want it or not, offering another chance whether you ask for one or not. There's a Japanese concept called mono no aware, the gentle sadness of things, the awareness that everything is temporary, and that very temporariness is what makes things beautiful. Cherry blossoms are precious because they last only a week. The full moon is special because it's only full for one night. And dawn is magnificent because it's so brief, so fleeting, so impossible to hold on to. You can't capture dawn. You can photograph it, but the photo never quite matches what you saw. You can paint it, but the colours are never quite right. You can write about it. I've been writing about it for the past hour, but words can only point at it, never contain it. Dawn has to be experienced. It has to be witnessed. And then, it has to be let go. That's the practice, if you want to call it that. Not holding on, not grasping, just noticing, appreciating, and then releasing. The dew sparkles. You see it sparkle. The sun rises higher, the air warms, and the dew evaporates. And that's okay. That's how it's supposed to work. Tomorrow there will be more dew. Tomorrow there will be another dawn. Your losses work the same way. The things you grieve, the people you miss, the versions of yourself you've left behind, they don't disappear. They become part of you, part of your landscape. They condense on your surfaces like dew, making you sparkle in certain lights, reminding you that you've loved deeply enough to cry and cared enough to feel the absence. And that's not a bad thing. That's actually what makes you human. What makes you real? Eos cries every morning and still brings the dawn. You carry your griefs and still show up for your life. The dew forms from cooling vapour and still catches the light like diamonds. These aren't separate facts. They're the same truth expressed different ways. So sleep now. Let your body cool. Let your mind settle. Let the day you just lived evaporate like dew, returning to vapour, making space for tomorrow. Whatever you're carrying, worries, sadness, exhaustion, unfinished business, let it condense into something simpler, something that can sparkle when the light hits it right, something that can be beautiful even though it's made of tears. Because morning is coming, it's always coming. And when it arrives, with its rosy fingers and saffron robes, with its gentle light and sparkling dew, it won't ask you to be perfect. It won't require you to have everything figured out. It'll just offer you what it always offers, another chance, another beginning, another moment of darkness giving way to light. That's the gift of Eos. That's the meaning of dew. That's why dawn matters, has always mattered, and will always matter. Not because it's complicated or mysterious, but because it's simple and true. The light returns. The world begins again. And on the grass outside your window, tiny drops of water prove that even tears can be transformed into beauty, that even sorrow can catch the light, and that even the oldest, saddest story in the world still ends with morning. Sleep well. Dawn is already on its way. Somewhere in the east, the sky is preparing to lighten. Eos is rising from her bed, spreading her golden wings and yoking her silver horses. She's crying, yes, she's always crying. But she's also driving forward, pulling light behind her, making way for another day. And tomorrow, when you wake, whether you see the dawn or sleep through it, whether you notice the dew or miss it entirely, it will have happened. The transformation will have occurred. The darkness will have become light. The vapour will have become droplets. The ancient story will have played out one more time, as it has every morning since the world began, as it will every morning until the world ends. That's what continuity means. That's what hope means. Not that things will never change, but that certain changes are guaranteed. Not that you'll never be sad again, but that sadness can become something that sparkles. Not that morning will solve everything, but that morning will come. And in that coming, in that reliable, beautiful, unstoppable returning of light, there's a kind of grace. The grace of beginning again. The grace of dew on grass. The grace of a goddess who cries and drives forward anyway, who grieves and still does her work, who knows that immortality means showing up every single morning, tears and all, and making the world beautiful, despite everything. Let that thought carry you into sleep. Let it settle on your mind like dew on grass. And when you wake, whether it's to dawn light or to your alarm or to someone calling your name. Remember that you've been part of this cycle, that you've rested while the earth turned, while the temperature dropped, while the moisture condensed, that you've been held by the same forces that create dawn and dew, held by the rhythm of darkness and light, ending and beginning, grief and beauty all mixed together. You're part of the morning sky, part of the gentle tale, part of the endless, ancient, utterly ordinary miracle of another day beginning. And that's enough. That's always been enough. That will always be enough. The dew forms, the dawn breaks, the light returns. Rest now, and let the night do its work. Morning will come soon enough, bringing with it everything morning brings. Light and possibility, tears and sparkle, and the chance to begin again. There is always a chance to begin again. This is the story of how winter came to be, how spring learned to return, how a mother's love changed the very fabric of the earth, and how a young woman discovered that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones we never planned to take. Now, picture this: a world without winter. No, really. Imagine it for a moment. Every single day the temperature hovers right at that perfect spot where you don't need a jacket but you're not sweating either. The kind of weather that makes you think, I should go for a walk, and then actually do it. That was the world before our story begins. The goddess Demeter had arranged it that way. She was the goddess of the harvest, of grain, of everything that grows and feeds humanity. And she'd gotten really, really good at her job. Too good, some might say. Though who's complaining about perfect weather and unlimited fresh bread? Demeter had figured out the formula for eternal abundance. The wheat grew golden and heavy. The grapevine sagged with fruit. The olive trees produced year-round, which honestly seems exhausting when you think about it. But the trees didn't complain. They just kept going, like the world's most reliable workers, never asking for a vacation. But here's the thing about perfection. It can get a little monotonous. The farmers knew exactly what to expect every single day. Plant, water, harvest, repeat. Plant, water, harvest, repeat. No surprises, no drama, just an endless succession of identical, gorgeous, productive days. And living right in the middle of all this abundance was Persephone. Now, Persephone wasn't interested in the technical aspects of agriculture. And who could blame her? She was young, though immortal, which complicates the concept of age quite a bit. And she spent her days doing exactly what she wanted, which mostly involved wandering through meadows, picking flowers, and generally existing in that state of contentment that makes other people slightly jealous. Her mother kept a close eye on her. Perhaps too close, if we're being honest. Demeter had poured all her considerable divine energy into two things: keeping the world fed and keeping Persephone safe. And she was excellent at both. Maybe a little too excellent. Persephone didn't mind. Not really. She loved her mother. She loved their life together. But there was something in her, some small seed of curiosity, that wondered what else existed beyond the eternally blooming meadows. Though she'd never say it out loud because, let's face it, complaining about living in paradise feels ungrateful. She had her favourite spots, of course. There was a grove of pomegranate trees where the fruit hung like small red lanterns. A field of narcissus flowers that released their perfume into the air so thickly you could almost taste it. A stream that ran clear and cold over smooth stones, where she'd sit and trail her fingers through the water, watching small silver fish dart away from her shadow. The nymphs who attended her were lovely company, in their way. They'd gossip and laugh and braid flowers into each other's hair. They'd race through the grass and dance in circles, and do all the things that young immortal beings do when they have infinite time and no responsibilities. But Persephone sometimes felt like she was watching her own life from a slight distance. like an actress who'd been playing the same role for so long she'd forgotten there were other parts she could audition for. Her mother's love surrounded her like a warm blanket. Protective. Constant, just a tiny bit suffocating. Though Persephone felt guilty even thinking it. You know how sometimes you'll take the same route to work for years, and one day you suddenly notice a building you've passed 1,000 times, but never really seen. The world of eternal spring had become like that for everyone except Demeter. Familiar to the point of invisibility. The gods on Mount Olympus, lounging around with their nectar and ambrosia, barely paid attention to the human world anymore. Why would they? Nothing ever changed down there. Same crops, same weather, same everything. Even the gods, who had literally infinite time on their hands, were getting bored. Zeus would sometimes look down from his throne and think about shaking things up. The way a bored CEO thinks about reorganizing the office just to see what happens. But then he'd get distracted by some other drama. There was always drama on Olympus, and the human world would continue its pleasant, unchanging existence. Demeter didn't notice any of this. She was too busy maintaining her perfect system, too focused on her daughter, and too invested in keeping everything exactly as it was. Change, to her mind, was just another word for risk, and risk was something she'd carefully eliminated from her domain. The humans adapted, the way humans always do. Without seasons to mark the passage of time, they created their own rhythms. Festivals based on the phases of the moon. Celebrations tied to birthdays and weddings and achievements. They marked time by generations, instead of by growing seasons. They got creative because they had to. But they also forgot some things. They forgot the sharp gratitude you feel for warmth when you've been cold. The way the first strawberry of spring tastes sweeter because you've waited months for it. The particular pleasure of pulling on a soft sweater when the air turns crisp. They had plenty, but they'd lost the context that makes plenty feel like a gift. Not that they knew what they were missing. How can you miss what you've never experienced? Meanwhile, beneath the earth, way beneath it, deeper than any root system, deeper than the caves where crystals grow in the dark, there was a whole other world. The underworld, the land of the dead, the place where souls went when their time in the sunshine was finished, and ruling over this realm was Hades. Now, let's clear something up right away. Hades wasn't evil. He wasn't some horned demon cackling over a cauldron of fire. That's not how the Greeks imagined him. He was just a god doing his job, and his job happened to involve managing the dead. Someone had to do it. Someone had to keep track of all those souls, maintain order in the shadowy halls, and ensure that the rivers of the underworld kept flowing. It was administrative work, mostly. Bureaucratic. Deeply, profoundly lonely. Hades had drawn the short straw, literally, when the three brothers divided up the cosmos. Zeus got the sky and basically got to be in charge of everything. Poseidon got the seas and could at least surface now and then to enjoy some sunshine and flirt with nymphs. And Hades got the underworld, which didn't come with much in the way of perks. He performed his duties with grim efficiency. He was good at it, actually. Fair. Impartial. The dead respected him in their own quiet way. But respect doesn't keep you warm at night, metaphorically speaking. The underworld was perpetually twilit, silent except for the whisper of souls and the distant sound of rivers flowing. No birdsong, no laughter, no flowers, obviously. Hades had started to feel like a shadow himself. He wasn't supposed to leave his realm very often. The rules about that were pretty strict. But every once in a while, he'd hitch up his chariot, pulled by 4 magnificent black horses that breathed smoke and moved like darkness given a form. And he'd rise up through a crack in the earth to visit the world above. Just to remind himself what light looked like. What colour was it? What it felt like to stand under an actual sky instead of a ceiling of stone. On one of these rare excursions, he saw her. The day started like every other day in the eternal spring. Persephone woke to sunshine streaming through her window. She stretched. She dressed in something light and flowing. Immortals don't really need to worry about fashion, but they do anyway. She ate some honey-drizzled figs and fresh bread that somehow tasted exactly like it had yesterday, and would taste tomorrow. Her mother was already up, of course, tending to some agricultural matter that required her divine attention. Something about wheat yields in Thessaly. Or was it grape production in Thrace? Persephone had stopped keeping track, so Persephone wandered out into the morning, accompanied by her usual group of nymphs, and headed toward her favourite meadow. The one with the narcissus flowers. They were in bloom, which they always were, but somehow today they seemed more fragrant than usual. Sweeter. Almost intoxicating. She waded into the field of white flowers, feeling them brush against her legs, their perfume rising around her like visible air. The nymphs scattered across the meadow, laughing and calling to each other, their voices blending with the sound of bees and the whisper of grass moving in the breeze. And then Persephone saw it. Right in the centre of the meadow, where there had definitely not been anything special before, grew a single flower unlike any she'd ever seen. It was massive, for one thing. The bloom was the size of her head, with petals that seemed to shift colour as she looked at them. Purple, melting into deep blue, melting into a red so dark it was almost black. The stem was thick and strong, and the whole thing seemed to pulse with its own light. She glanced around. The nymphs hadn't noticed. They were too busy with their own flower gathering at the edges of the meadow. Persephone walked toward the impossible flower. Each step felt significant somehow, though she couldn't have said why. The morning seemed to hold its breath. Even the bees stopped humming. She reached out to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the petals, the earth opened. It didn't crack. It didn't rumble with warning. The ground simply ceased to be solid, the way ice becomes water, the way a door swings open. One moment, Persephone was standing in a meadow full of sunshine and narcissus flowers. And the next moment, she was falling through darkness. She didn't scream. There wasn't time. The fall happened too quickly, and it felt too much like dreaming, that sensation of weightlessness, of reality becoming unstuck. And then there were horses. 4 of them, massive and dark, their breath like smoke, pulling a chariot made of black stone that gleamed like wet obsidian. And standing in that chariot, holding the reins with steady hands, was a figure dressed in darkness itself. Hades caught her, not roughly but firmly. He guided her into the chariot beside him with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the violence of what had just happened. And then, without a word, he urged the horses onward. They plunged deeper. The crack in the earth sealed itself above them, shutting out the light like a closing eye. Persephone gripped the edge of the chariot and tried to make sense of what was happening. Tried to understand why her heart was hammering in her chest, but she wasn't actually afraid. Or maybe she was afraid, but it was mixed with something else, something she didn't have a name for. Curiosity, maybe. Or the strange exhilaration that comes from knowing your life has just changed completely, and you can never go back. They descended through layers of earth, through stone and soil, through caves where blind fish swam in underground lakes, through tunnels carved by water over millions of years. The horses never slowed. Hades never spoke. And Persephone, for the first time in her life, didn't know what was going to happen next. The air grew cooler, then cold. Then not exactly cold, but absent of temperature entirely, as if warmth was a concept that didn't exist here. The darkness was absolute, but somehow Persephone could still see. The chariot glowed with its own faint light, and the horses seemed to carry illumination with them, like moving shadows that defined the space around them. And then they emerged into the underworld proper. The underworld wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't fire and brimstone, no lakes of burning sulphur or demons with pitchforks. It was simply quiet, vast, filled with a soft grey light that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The landscape stretched out in all directions, plains of silver grass that didn't quite look like grass, hills that rose and fell like frozen waves, and rivers that flowed but made no sound. And everywhere, moving through this twilight realm, were the souls of the dead. They weren't scary. They looked like people, just more transparent, more distant. They moved with purpose, but no urgency, walking along paths that Persephone couldn't see, headed toward destinations she couldn't guess. They didn't seem unhappy exactly, just finished, complete, done with the messy business of living and now engaged in whatever it is that souls do when their time is over. The chariot finally slowed, then stopped in front of a palace that seemed to grow directly out of the ground. It was made of dark stone, polished smooth, with pillars that rose like the trunks of impossible trees. It wasn't decorative or showy, it was functional, austere, and somehow deeply impressive. Hades stepped down from the chariot and then, with surprising courtesy, offered his hand to help Persephone down. She took it, partly because she needed the help, and partly because she was curious what a god's hand would feel like. It was warm, which surprised her, solid, real. She looked at him properly for the first time. He was tall, which most gods were, but not in that exaggerated way that made you crane your neck. His face was serious, not angry, not cruel, just deeply serious, like someone who'd seen enough that jokes felt beside the point. His eyes were dark, and when he looked at her, she felt truly seen for the first time in her life. Not as Demeter's daughter, not as a lovely ornament in the eternal spring, just as herself, whoever that was. He gestured toward the palace. Inside, the palace was surprisingly comfortable. High ceilings, yes, but not cathedral vast. Halls that branched and curved in ways that suggested organic growth rather than architectural planning. And everywhere, that same soft grey light that didn't cast shadows because it came from all directions at once. Hades led her through corridors lined with doors. Persephone wondered what was behind them. Offices? Bedrooms? Storage closets for spare souls? She didn't ask. Her voice seemed to have temporarily relocated to somewhere in her chest, where it sat, waiting to see what happened next. They entered a large chamber that might have been a throne room, except it felt more like a study. There was a throne, yes, carved from a single piece of black stone. But there were also shelves lined with scrolls, tables covered with what looked like ledgers, and a general atmosphere of busy organization rather than imperial grandeur. Hades finally spoke. His voice was deep and quiet, like distant thunder or a cello played in another room. What he said was simple enough. She would stay here. She would be his queen. The loneliness of ruling the underworld was too much to bear alone, and he had chosen her to share it with him. Persephone felt something inside her shift. Not quite anger. She'd never been very good at anger. Something more like recognition. This wasn't a request. It wasn't a conversation. It was an announcement. She'd been plucked from her life like that impossible flower she'd reached for, transplanted into darkness without being asked if she wanted to go. And yet there was something in her that didn't immediately want to leave. Some part of her recognized this moment as the thing she'd been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting. Change, risk, the unknown. Everything her mother had carefully kept away from her. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. She simply stood in that strange throne room in the kingdom of the dead and felt her life split cleanly into before and after. Above ground, Demeter was having the worst day of her immortal life. She'd returned from Thessaly, or Thrace, whichever one it was. to find the meadow empty. The nymphs were there, confused and worried, talking over each other as they tried to explain what they'd seen. Or rather, what they hadn't seen. One moment, Persephone was there, reaching towards something in the grass. The next moment, gone. Simply gone, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Which, to be fair, it had. Demeter's panic was immediate and absolute. She called her daughter's name. She searched the meadow, the surrounding fields, the groves, and the streams. She questioned the nymphs again and again, hoping they'd remember some crucial detail they'd forgotten. She scoured the landscape looking for any sign, any clue. Nothing. She expanded her search. She left her domain, which she never did, and began travelling across the world. She walked roads and climbed mountains and waded through rivers. She asked everyone she met, gods, nymphs, mortals, even animals, if they'd seen her daughter. Most hadn't. Some offered sympathy. None had answers. Days passed, then weeks. Demeter's panic hardened into something darker. Grief mixed with rage, forming a volatile compound that would have consequences for everyone. Because here's the thing about Demeter. Her power was tied to her emotional state. Her ability to make things grow, to maintain the eternal spring, to keep the world fed, all of it flowed from her. And as her grief deepened, her power began to falter. The wheat in the field stopped growing. The grapevines stopped producing. The olive trees, which had never taken a break in recorded history, suddenly went dormant. The eternal spring, maintained for so long with such careful attention, began to crack like a facade. The temperature dropped. At first, the mortals thought it was just a weird day. Cooler than usual, nothing to worry about. They put on an extra layer and went about their business. But the coolness didn't stop. It kept going. Day by day, degree by degree, the temperature fell. The grass, which had always been green, began to fade. The flowers, which had bloomed without ceasing, started to close up and wither, and then, one morning, there was frost. The farmers came out at dawn to find their fields covered in white crystals that melted when touched, but left the plants they'd touched damaged and limp. They'd never seen frost before. They didn't have a word for it. They stood in their ruined fields and tried to understand what they were looking at. The gods on Olympus noticed, of course. Kind of hard to miss when the entire world starts changing. Zeus sent messengers to Demeter, asking her politely if she could maybe get back to work. She ignored them. He sent more messengers with less polite requests. She ignored those too. Because what did she care about the world's crops when her daughter was missing? What did it matter if mortals were cold or hungry when Persephone was gone? They could all freeze and starve for all she cared. Nothing mattered except finding her child. She continued her search with single-minded intensity, paying no attention to the chaos spreading in her wake. She'd become a force of pure maternal devotion, scorching the earth not with fire but with absence. Where she walked, things died. Not because she willed it, but because all her life-giving energy had turned inward, focusing on her grief. The world learned what winter was. Meanwhile, Persephone was adjusting to her new reality with the kind of practical acceptance that surprises people when they discover it in themselves. The underworld was strange, yes, quiet and grey and filled with the dead. But it wasn't horrible. It was just different. Very, very different from the eternal spring she'd known her entire life. Hades left her alone, mostly. He had work to do. The administrative tasks of the underworld apparently never stopped. And he seemed to understand that she needed space to process what had happened. But he'd appear at mealtimes, sitting across from her in a dining hall that was surprisingly cozy, given the circumstances. They'd eat in silence at first. Then gradually, they began to talk. He wasn't what she'd expected. He was serious, yes, but not grim. He had a dry sense of humour that caught her off guard. When she made a joke about the underworld's interior decoration, or lack thereof, he actually laughed. It was a rusty sound, like a door opening after years of being closed, but it was genuine. He told her about his work, about the responsibility of shepherding souls, of maintaining the delicate balance of the afterlife. He spoke of it not with pride, but with a kind of resigned dedication. It was his burden, yes, but it was also his purpose. Someone had to do it. She found herself talking to him in return, about the eternal spring, about her mother's protective love that sometimes felt like a beautiful cage, about the feeling she'd had right before the earth opened that her life was about to start for real. Days passed, or what passed for days in a realm without sun. Persephone explored the palace, discovering rooms she didn't know existed, a library filled with scrolls containing the stories of every soul who'd ever lived. A garden, yes, a garden in the underworld, where strange pale plants grew without light. A balcony that overlooked the fields of asphodel, where ordinary souls wandered in their peaceful, purposeless eternity. She still missed the sun. She missed colour. She missed her mother, though that feeling was complicated by other feelings she was still sorting through. But she didn't feel like a prisoner, exactly. More like someone who'd opened a door they didn't know was there and found an entirely different house on the other side. The palace had a kitchen, which seemed funny when you thought about it. The dead didn't eat, but Hades, being a god, still needed sustenance, and apparently he'd maintain this small reminder of the living world. Persephone had been invited to eat with him, but she'd always declined. Not because the food wasn't good. The underworld's kitchen somehow produced meals that rivaled anything she'd eaten in her mother's realm. Fresh bread that steamed when broken open. Honey that glowed gold even in the grey light. Fruits that looked like they'd been picked that morning from trees that didn't exist here. She didn't eat because she'd heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. If you ate food in the underworld, you were bound to it. You couldn't leave. It was one of those rules that seemed arbitrary until you thought about it. And then it made a kind of mythological sense. Consumption as contract. You become part of what you take into yourself. So she'd politely declined every meal, accepting only water, which apparently didn't count. And Hades had never pushed, never insisted. He'd simply had food prepared and placed before her, then waited to see what she'd do. But on this particular day, she'd lost count of how many. She was hungry. Properly, deeply hungry in a way she hadn't been before. And sitting on the table in front of her was a pomegranate. Not just any pomegranate. The underworld version. The skin was a deeper red than any she'd seen, so dark it was almost purple. When Hades cut it open, slowly, carefully, with a small knife that caught the grey light, the seeds inside glowed like rubies, like drops of captured light, like tiny hearts. They looked at each other across the table. She saw the question in his eyes, unspoken but clear. This was a choice. He wouldn't force her. He'd brought her here without asking. Yes. But this? This was entirely up to her. She thought about her mother searching the world above, grief-stricken and desperate. She thought about the eternal spring, the safety, and the predictability. She thought about this strange kingdom of shadow and silence, and the serious God who ruled it with unexpected gentleness. She reached out and took 6 seeds. Just 6, though the pomegranate held hundreds. She placed them in her palm, watching how they caught the light. They were beautiful. They were a decision. They were a door closing and a different door opening. She ate them, one by one. They were sweet and tart and complicated, the way real things are, the way life is when it's not being carefully managed and protected. Hades didn't smile, exactly. but something in his face softened. Relief, maybe, or recognition. The understanding that she'd chosen to stay, at least partially, that she'd seen his kingdom and hadn't run. Back in the world above, things had gotten dire. The crops had failed completely. The trees stood bare and skeletal against grey skies. The temperature had dropped so low that water froze in the streams, forming this bizarre, solid substance that the mortals kept trying to figure out. Ice, they'd eventually call it, but right now they just called it the curse. Because that's what they thought it was. A curse from the gods. Punishment for some unknown transgression. They sacrificed what little food they had left, burning it in temples and praying for forgiveness. They didn't know that their suffering was just collateral damage from a mother's grief. Zeus, watching from Olympus, finally admitted that this couldn't continue. The humans were dying. The world was broken, and Demeter showed no signs of stopping her search or relenting in her grief. He needed to intervene, which he hated doing because it meant admitting that he'd lost control of the situation. He sent Hermes, the messenger god, the only one who could move freely between all the realms, to investigate, to ask around, to find out what had actually happened to Persephone. Hermes, who was clever and quick and generally good at his job, started by questioning everyone who might have seen something. The nymphs, useless. They'd seen nothing. The local farmers, equally useless. Various minor deities who might have been passing through, mostly useless, though one river god mentioned seeing Hades' chariot emerging from the earth around that time, which was unusual. That was the thread he needed. Hermes followed it down, making connections, asking more pointed questions. And eventually, the truth emerged. Hades had taken her. The king of the underworld, lonely and tired of his isolation, had spotted Persephone in her meadow and decided she'd make a suitable queen. It wasn't exactly kidnapping by the standards of the gods. They had different rules about these things and looser interpretations of consent, which doesn't make it right, but does make it historically accurate to the stories. But it was close enough that Zeus knew he had a problem. Hermes travelled to the underworld to confirm the story. The meeting happened in that same throne room where Persephone had first stood. Zeus sent Hermes as his representative. Smart, since the king of the gods showing up personally would have made the whole thing feel more like an invasion. Demeter came too, of course, having finally learned where her daughter was. She'd wanted to charge in immediately, to tear the underworld apart stone by stone until she found Persephone. Zeus had talked her down, barely. Hades received them with perfect courtesy. He offered them seats, refreshments, and all the proper hospitality. Demeter refused everything, standing rigid with barely contained fury. Hermes accepted some wine, because he was Hermes and he was thirsty. And then Persephone entered the room. Demeter made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Relief and rage and love all compressed into a single syllable. She moved toward her daughter, arms outstretched, ready to embrace her and then immediately drag her back to the world above, where she belonged. But Persephone held up her hand, stopping her mother mid-stride. She looked different. Not dramatically so. She was still herself, still had the same face, the same eyes. But there was something else there now. A certainty. A groundedness. She'd found some core in herself that hadn't existed before, or had existed, but hadn't been tested. She'd eaten the pomegranate seeds, she told them. 6 of them. She'd made her choice. The room went silent. Even Hermes stopped drinking his wine, which was saying something. Demeter's face cycled through emotions too quickly to track. Shock, betrayal, confusion, back to rage. She turned on Hades, ready to unleash divine fury that would crack the underworld's foundations. But Zeus, speaking through Hermes, stopped her. The law was clear. Eating food in the underworld bound you to it. Persephone couldn't leave permanently, but perhaps, and here Hermes demonstrated why he was so valuable as a diplomat, perhaps a compromise could be reached. They negotiated like gods who'd learned not to trust each other, which they were. Each side had leverage. Demeter could and would let the entire world die if her daughter wasn't returned. Hades had the law on his side. Persephone had eaten the seeds, and the binding was real. And Persephone herself, who everyone kept forgetting to actually consult, had her own preferences that were more complicated than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The solution, when they reached it, felt inevitable in retrospect. A split custody arrangement, more or less, dictated by the number of seeds she'd eaten. 6 seeds. There are 12 months in a year. For 6 months, Persephone would return to the world above, to her mother, to the light. For 6 months, she would remain in the underworld with Hades. It wasn't perfect. No compromises. Demeter wanted her daughter back completely. Hades had hoped she'd choose to stay permanently. And Persephone? Persephone had discovered that she wanted both. The light and the darkness. The familiar safety of her mother's love and the strange new partnership she'd found in the shadows. But it would work. It would have to work. The terms were set. The agreement was sealed with the kind of divine bureaucracy that ensures promises are kept even when you'd rather break them. And then came the practical question. When would she leave? Now, Demeter insisted. Immediately. She'd been searching for months. The world was dying, and she wanted her daughter back right now. Persephone looked at Hades. Something passed between them. Not spoken, just understood. She'd return, the look said. This wasn't goodbye forever, just goodbye for now. She embraced her mother, feeling the relief and desperation in Demeter's grip. She nodded to Hermes, who'd been remarkably patient through the whole negotiation. And then, with one last glance at the kingdom of shadows that had somehow become home, she let herself be led back toward the light. The journey up was nothing like the journey down. No chariot, no horses, no dramatic plunge through the earth. Just Hermes guiding them, Persephone and her mother through the winding paths that led from the underworld to the surface. They walked through the grey twilight, past the wandering souls who barely glanced at them. They crossed the river Styx, where the ferryman Charon nodded, in acknowledgement, but didn't stop them. They climbed through caves that grew gradually less dark, where the air shifted from that temperatureless void to actual cold. Demeter held her daughter's hand the entire time, as if afraid she'd disappear again if contact was broken. She kept turning to look at Persephone, studying her face, trying to find what had changed. Trying to understand how her daughter could have stayed in that dark place, could have eaten food that bound her there, and could have made a choice that meant they'd be separated for half of every year. She didn't ask these questions out loud. Not yet. There'd be time for questions later. Right now, she just needed to get her daughter back to the light. They emerged at dawn. The crack in the earth opened like a gentle exhale, and suddenly they were standing in the meadow where it had all begun. The same field of narcissus, though now the flowers were dead, brown stalks sticking up through frost-covered ground. Persephone felt the sun on her face for the first time in months. It was sharp and bright and wonderful and overwhelming. She'd forgotten how intense the world could be, how loud, how colourful, how alive. Demeter stood beside her daughter and felt her power returning. The relief of having Persephone back began to thaw the frozen grief that had locked away her abilities. She could feel the earth responding to her again, ready to bloom. But it would take time. The damage was too severe to fix instantly, even for a goddess. The world would need to wake slowly from its unwanted sleep. Over the next several weeks, the world transformed. The temperature began to rise, though gradually. The ice melted into water that soaked into the thirsty ground. The frozen earth softened, becoming workable again, And then, slowly, green began to return. Not everywhere at once. It started with small shoots in protected places. A crocus pushing up through the mud. A bud forming on a tree branch. Grass showing new growth at its base. The world was learning to live again, hesitantly, like someone recovering from a long illness. Demeter poured herself into the renewal. This was what she knew how to do. This was her purpose. But it was different now, harder, edged with the knowledge that it was temporary. In 6 months, Persephone would return to the underworld, and Demeter would have to let her go. That knowledge changed everything. She couldn't maintain the eternal spring anymore. It wasn't just that her power had been disrupted, though it had. It was that the perfect, unchanging abundance she created before required a peace of mind she no longer possessed. Required a certainty that she could protect what she loved. That certainty was gone. So the spring that year was different, more vigorous, almost desperate. The flowers bloomed with intensity, as if making up for lost time. The crops grew faster than they ever had, pushing up through the soil with urgent energy. Everything was too much, too green, too alive, too abundant. The mortals, who'd survived the cold winter by sheer, stubborn resilience, emerged from their homes blinking in the sudden brightness. They planted seeds in ground that was finally soft again. They tended new growth with grateful, careful hands. They'd learned something during the cold months. How to preserve food. How to prepare for hardship. How to appreciate warmth after knowing cold. Persephone spent those months with her mother, falling back into familiar patterns, but finding them changed. The meadows were the same, but she saw them differently now. The colours seemed brighter because she'd lived without them. The birds' song seemed sweeter because she'd known silence. Even the simple act of walking in sunshine felt like a gift rather than a given. Her mother watched her constantly, protectively, trying to make up for the months of separation. But there was a new wariness in Demeter's love, a recognition that her daughter had become someone she didn't entirely know, someone who'd made choices that Demeter wouldn't have made for her. They didn't talk about Hades. Demeter couldn't bring herself to say his name, and Persephone didn't push. But she thought about him, about the quiet palace and the grey light and the way he'd looked at her across a table, seeing her clearly. She thought about the work he did, shepherding souls with patient dedication. She thought about returning and felt not dread, but a kind of anticipation mixed with sadness at leaving. The months passed. Summer came with its heavy warmth the way it always had, but now the mortals appreciated it. They worked in the fields under the sun and felt grateful for the sweat on their backs. They harvested crops and stored them carefully, remembering the hunger of winter. They celebrated the abundance while knowing, somehow, that it wouldn't last. As the time for Persephone's return to the underworld approached, Demeter's mood darkened. She became short-tempered and distracted. The plants responded to her emotional state, growing more slowly, the fruits ripening unevenly. It was subtle at first, but perceptible. Persephone tried to comfort her mother, tried to explain that she wasn't being taken away, that she was choosing to honour the agreement, that 6 months wasn't forever, that she'd return again in spring. But Demeter heard only that her daughter was leaving, going back to the darkness voluntarily, choosing the underworld, choosing him, over the light and safety of home. The day Persephone was to depart, Hermes arrived to escort her. He was professional about it, neither friendly nor cold, just doing his job. Demeter stood stiffly as her daughter embraced her, not quite returning the hug, her face set in lines of barely controlled grief. Persephone descended through the earth again, following Hermes through the winding paths. And behind her, above her, the world began its slow retreat into cold. The leaves on the trees, which had been green and full, began to change colour. Yellow at first, then orange, then red. They were beautiful in their dying, which nobody had expected. The mortals stopped their work to stare at the trees, transformed into flames of colour against the sky. And then the leaves fell. It happened over weeks, not all at once. The trees released their leaves in waves, carpeting the ground with colour that gradually faded to brown. The temperature dropped steadily. The grass stopped growing. The crops finished their cycle and died back, leaving stubble in the fields. The mortals harvested what they could and stored it away, remembering the lessons from the first winter. They prepared. They gathered wood for fires. They made warm clothes from wool and leather. They brought their animals into shelter. This time, when winter came, they were ready for it. And so it went. 6 months in the underworld, where Persephone learned to rule alongside Hades, making decisions about souls and their fates, walking through the grey gardens, and finding beauty in shadow. 6 months in the world above, where she brought her mother joy and watched the earth bloom in response to Demeter's happiness. Each transition brought change. When Persephone descended, autumn came, then winter. The world withdrew into itself, resting. When she ascended, spring returned, then summer. The world exploded into life, growing and producing and celebrating existence. The mortals adapted. They learned to read the signs. When the days grew shorter and the air turned crisp, they knew Persephone had returned to the underworld. Time to harvest, to prepare, to settle in for the cold months. When the first green shoots appeared and the ice began to melt, they knew she'd returned to her mother. Time to plant, to tend, and to take advantage of the growing season. They created new celebrations around these transitions. Festivals to mark the planting season, when Persephone brought spring. Harvest festivals came when autumn came and she descended again. They built their lives around the rhythm of her journey, up and down, light and dark, presence and absence. The gods on Olympus watched this new pattern establish itself and decided it was acceptable. Not ideal. Zeus would have preferred the old eternal spring, which had required less management, but workable. The mortals weren't dying en masse anymore. Demeter had found a way to function despite her grief, and Hades seemed, well, not happy exactly, but less lonely, more purposeful. Even Demeter, though she never stopped missing her daughter during the winter months, found something valuable in the new arrangement. The intensity of reunion each spring, the sweetness of time together when you know it's limited. The way absence can make love sharper, more present, and more intentional. She still didn't like Hades, probably never would. But she'd learned to accept that her daughter had found something in the underworld that she needed. Some part of herself that could only exist in shadow. The mortals, after several cycles of seasons, began to notice something unexpected. Winter, which had seemed like pure punishment at first, brought gifts they hadn't anticipated. The cold killed pests that had plagued their crops. The freeze broke up soil, making it easier to work in spring. The rest period allowed fields to recover their fertility, producing better yields when planting season returned. They discovered that some foods actually improved when stored through winter. The bitterness leaving greens, the starch converting to sweetness in root vegetables. They found new pleasures too. The beauty of frost patterns on windows, the silence of snow, which they'd learned to welcome rather than fear. The coziness of gathering around fires during the long dark evenings, telling stories, making music and strengthening the bonds of family and community. Winter became a time for indoor work, for weaving and crafting, for repairing tools and planning for the year ahead. For rest, which bodies and spirits needed more than they'd realized when every day had been the same perfect temperature and every season had been growing season. They learned that the world needed cycles, that endless summer would be as exhausting as an endless winter would be deadly. that the rhythm of growth and rest, abundance and scarcity, light and darkness, that rhythm was what made life rich, rather than monotonous. The philosophers among them started using seasons as metaphors. Life has its winters, they said, periods of hardship and withdrawal and waiting. But winter always ends, spring always returns. The trick is to remember that when you're in the cold and to prepare for winter when you're in the warmth. They were learning wisdom from the story playing out above their heads. From Demeter's grief and Persephone's journey and the compromise that had created the seasons. They were learning that loss and reunion, separation and return, were part of the pattern of existence. Meanwhile, Persephone was discovering who she was in the darkness. Not Demeter's daughter, not the girl from the meadow, but she herself was fully formed, with authority and purpose. She learned to judge souls with fairness, to distinguish between those who deserved punishment and those who deserved reward, to understand that most people fell somewhere in the middle. Not heroes, not villains, just humans who'd done their best with what they had. She developed a reputation for mercy tempered with justice, for seeing nuance in situations that Hades, worn down by centuries of similar cases, might have rushed through. She walked the fields of asphodel and spoke with the ordinary dead, learning their stories. She visited the Elysian fields, where heroes dwelt in eternal peace. She even ventured into Tartarus, where the truly wicked suffered their punishments and came away sobered but not frightened. Someone had to bear witness. Someone had to remember what evil looked like so they could recognize good when they saw it. Hades watched her grow into her role with something that might have been pride. They'd become partners in a way neither had expected. Not just husband and wife, though they were that too, in their own strange way, but colleagues, co-rulers, two people sharing an impossible burden and finding that together it was almost manageable. They developed routines, meals shared in comfortable silence or easy conversation, walks through the underworld's strange landscapes, pointing out things they found beautiful or interesting. Long discussions about how to handle particularly complex cases, bouncing ideas off each other until they found solutions. The loneliness that had driven Hades to take such drastic action in the first place had eased. The underworld felt less like a prison and more like a kingdom. Still austere, still serious, still grey and quiet, but now it was home to both of them for half the year. Persephone missed the sun during those months, missed colour and warmth and the feeling of grass under her feet. Missed her mother, though that relationship had become more complex. But she didn't regret her choice. The 6 pomegranate seeds had bound her to the underworld, yes, but they'd also freed her to become someone more complete than the girl who'd spent eternity picking flowers in an unchanging spring. And then spring would come, and she'd ascend again into light. The transition never got easier. Your eyes have to readjust to brightness after months of grey. Your skin has to remember how to feel the sun. Your heart has to open again to the chaos and colour of the living world. But every year she managed it. Every year she'd emerge from the earth and see her mother's face transformed by joy. Every year the world would respond to their reunion by blooming with renewed vigour. Persephone brought things back from the underworld, though nothing physical. She brought perspective, an understanding of endings that made beginnings sweeter, a knowledge of what lay beyond life that made life itself more precious. She'd seen what came after, and it wasn't terrible, which freed people to live more fully in the present. She told stories sometimes, carefully edited, about the underworld, about the souls she'd met and the lessons she'd learned, about the work of shepherding the dead and maintaining the afterlife. The mortals listened, fascinated and comforted. Death wasn't the enemy they'd imagined. It was just another kingdom, another part of existence, with its own rules and rhythms. Her mother didn't want to hear these stories. Demeter would change the subject whenever Persephone mentioned the underworld, would find urgent agricultural matters that required attention, would suddenly remember something that needed doing elsewhere. She couldn't bear to think about her daughter in that dark place, couldn't reconcile the Persephone who returned each spring with the queen of the dead she'd become. But gradually, over years and decades and centuries, Demeter softened. The sharp edges of her grief wore down. She began to see that her daughter hadn't been stolen so much as she'd found herself. That the girl who returned each spring was more whole than the one who'd been taken. That sometimes love means letting go, even when it hurts. Something else happened over time, subtle but significant. The underworld and the upper world, which had always been completely separate, began to influence each other in new ways. Seeds that fell to the ground in autumn when Persephone descended would rest in the dark earth all winter, in a kind of underworld of their own, before sprouting in spring when she returned. The cycle of death and rebirth that governed human souls began to mirror itself in the plant world. Things had to die to be reborn, had to end to begin again. The mortals planted their dead in the ground, returning bodies to the earth. They developed rituals that honoured both aspects of Persephone, the spring maiden and the underworld queen. They understood, in a way their ancestors hadn't, that these weren't contradictory roles, that you could be both bringer of life and guardian of death, that the two were connected, necessary opposites that defined each other. Hades and Demeter never became friends. That would be asking too much. But they reached a kind of détente, a mutual respect born from sharing the thing they both loved. They'd nod to each other during the transitions when Hermes guided Persephone between realms. Brief acknowledgements that they were on the same side now, however reluctantly. Zeus, watching from Olympus, was satisfied. The compromise had held. The seasons had become part of the world's rhythm. The mortals had adapted, and the drama, always his primary concern, had died down to manageable levels. But the real victory wasn't political or practical. It was personal. Three beings, Demeter, Persephone, and Hades, had found a way to honour their needs and desires while recognising the needs and desires of others. They'd created a pattern that hurt, yes, but hurt less than the alternatives. They'd learned that perfect happiness isn't possible, but meaningful happiness is. Centuries passed. The mortals lived and died in their generations, each one learning about seasons from their parents, passing the knowledge to their children. The festivals became traditions, became customs, and became the unquestioned way things were. Nobody remembered the eternal spring. It had become a myth, a golden age that may or may not have actually existed. But Demeter remembered, and Persephone remembered, and Hades remembered. They were immortal, after all. Time moved differently for them. Each cycle was the same and different. The pattern repeated: descent, winter, ascent, spring, summer, autumn, repeat. But within that pattern were infinite variations. Some winters were harsher than others, reflecting particularly difficult separations. Some springs were more glorious, marking especially sweet reunions. Persephone grew into her dual nature with increasing ease. She learned to carry both roles simultaneously, rather than switching between them. She was always both the spring maiden and the underworld queen, just as she was always both Demeter's daughter and Hades' wife. The contradictions that had seemed impossible at first became the foundation of her strength. She taught the younger gods and goddesses who came to her for advice that you could be more than one thing, that you could hold multiple truths at once, that the self wasn't a single fixed point, but a constellation of possibilities, and you didn't have to choose just one star. Hades changed too, though more subtly. The grim seriousness that had defined him softened around the edges. He learned to appreciate beauty in small moments. He started to see his kingdom not as a burden, but as sacred work. Having someone to share it with had made all the difference. And Demeter learned the hardest lesson of all. That love doesn't mean possession. That being a good mother meant supporting her daughter's choices, even the ones that caused her pain. That Persephone's happiness mattered more than her own comfort. So here we are, thousands of years later, living in the world that Persephone's choice created. Every spring that arrives after winter. Every harvest that comes before the cold. Every cycle of planting and reaping, growing and resting, light and darkness. These are all echoes of that ancient story. The seasons that govern your life, that determine when you plant your garden or when you pull out your winter coat, that shape the rhythm of the year, these came from a mother's grief and a daughter's courage and a compromise between the upper world and the lower. Think about that. The world changes because people change. Because relationships evolve. Because sometimes what seems like a catastrophe is actually a transformation. When winter comes and the world seems dead, remember that Persephone is in the underworld, doing necessary work, growing in ways that require darkness. When spring returns and everything blooms, remember that she's ascended again, bringing with her the wisdom she gained below. You live in a world of cycles because they lived through change. You experience rest and growth, endings and beginnings, because they learned that these things are necessary, that you can't have eternal spring without losing something essential, that the price of never losing anything is never growing. Let's bring this to a close now, gently, the way evening settles over a landscape. Persephone is still making that journey, up and down, light and dark, mother and husband, spring and winter. She'll make it tomorrow and the day after and every day forward, because that's the nature of cycles. They continue. Demeter is still releasing her daughter twice a year, and it still hurts, and she's still learning to be okay with that hurt, because it comes with joy too. The hurt and the joy are woven together now, inseparable, like roots and branches. Hades is still ruling the underworld, but he's not alone anymore. Half the year, he has a partner, someone who sees him clearly and chooses to return. That's worth the loneliness of the other half. And the world keeps turning through its seasons, following the pattern they established so long ago. Winter will come again. Spring will follow. The cycle continues because once upon a time, 3 immortals learned to compromise, and the earth herself learned to rest and wake, in an endless rhythm that sustains everything. Your own life has seasons too, periods of growth and periods of rest, times when you're in the light and times when you're walking through shadow, moments of separation and moments of reunion. This is normal. This is how it's supposed to work. This is the pattern. So as you drift towards sleep now, let yourself rest in the knowledge that cycles are natural. Those endings lead to beginnings. That spring always comes even after the longest winter. That you contain multitudes, just like Persephone. You can be more than one thing, hold more than one truth, and love more than one place. Let yourself sink into the comfort of knowing that the world has rhythms larger than your worries. That the seasons will change whether you stress about it or not. That rest is productive. That darkness has its purpose, and that everything that falls will rise again in its own time. Tomorrow the sun will come up, the way it always does. The earth will keep turning, the seasons will continue their ancient dance, and you'll wake refreshed, ready for whatever part of the cycle you're in, knowing that it won't last forever, neither the hard parts nor the easy parts. And that's exactly as it should be. Sleep well. Spring will come. And so, the story ends, as all good stories do, with everyone changed but continuing. With problems solved but new ones emerging. With the world a little different than it was before, shaped by the choices of those who dared to change it. Rest now. The seasons will keep watch while you sleep.